So welcome to this joint DUFAS EY webinar. Thanks to you all for dialing in. And this is number 2 of our series of 3 webinars on ESG reporting. And today we have 2 speakers in the call who really will share their experience on a daily basis with ESG reporting, which is also quite a challenge, as they will explain to you, and which you might recognize. So we have one speaker from a fund administration company, which will be introduced later, and we have a speaker from an asset manager who both share their experience from daily practice. We would love to make it an interactive session, and after each of the presentations there's room for Q&A. And I just explained to you how you can put your questions in. So feel free during the presentations already to leave your questions. And you can do that in the top right of your screen. You see different buttons. There's one with a question mark in it. You can click that one and leave your question there, and we will pick it up at that from that point. So this webinar will be recorded. There will also be a report made out of it, and it will be distributed later for people who cannot join this webinar, your colleagues who might want to share this content with. So this is the setup, as you see on your screen, of the webinar of today, the different speakers we have, and each of the speakers is briefly also introduced by a short part of EY with their view on ESG reporting. And last week I understood, Remco, great teamwork that we set up these webinars together. I was not there last week, but I'm curious, what are your key takeaways from the first session?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Iris. Indeed, for those who don't know me, I'm Remco Bluijs. I'm leading our sustainable finance practice in the Netherlands. Indeed, last week we had our first webinar, and I had 4 key takeaways, also 4 slides. Not going to talk about it in detail, but the first one, which you now see on the screen, is showing that based on our global ESG investor survey that we're doing on a yearly basis, is mentioning that more than 70% of the investors that we surveyed around the world are really focusing on ESG disclosures. So that's also giving you the relevance of things that we are doing or that you are planning to do on ESG disclosures and reporting. The second one was about, we summarized the key challenges of ESG reporting and ESG assurance. We summarized those 6, and number 2 and number 3, that there are no generally accepted ESG reporting standards, and that there's sometimes a lack of availability and reliability of data. That was another big challenge, and those topics we're going to talk about today in the webinar as well. Then the next takeaway was, we presented our EY 5-step approach for ESG reporting and ESG assurance, and we highlighted those steps. And Annabeth, my colleague, will talk about step number 3 later on as well, in between the 2 other speakers, which Iris already mentioned. And the last takeaway, last but not least, I should say, that was that Randy from DUFAS gave an overview of the EU Sustainable Finance Plan and what is the impact for asset managers, when do you need to incorporate specific actions, reporting requirements, and he presented this, in my view, a very good overview of the requirements, timelines, where do you need to disclose something, etc. And I heard that many of you really supported by this overview, so that's good to work on that. I think that were the main takeaways from the previous webinar.
Thanks, Remco. And you, the next speaker, the first speaker today, is someone you knew and you recruited for this webinar. Can you introduce him briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. He has a large bio, but I'm not going to summarize it in detail. But it's Andy Pitts-Tucker. He's from Apex Fund Services, and he's going to elaborate on what's Apex doing. For those of you who are familiar in the Dutch fund business, and most of you are, of course, is that Apex was acquiring Custom House, and that was acquiring TMF fund services many years ago. So there's historical background within the Netherlands as well. And Andy indeed is working for more than 24 years already in the financial services industry. So he knows the industry and around working for many famous asset managers as well. And last year he started the ESG department within Apex Group, so to say. And he's working on, as we call it, to turn data into positive action. So he's working on all kind of ESG services that Apex is providing. So I would like to give the floor to you, Andy, and you can elaborate on the things you would like to share. You need to unmute, Andy, but...
Sorry, let's start again. Thank you, Dufas and EY for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Remco, thank you for the introduction. As you said, I spent 24 years in the financial services, and my latter years of that, I was working with an asset manager within the sustainable development division. We were creating private equity, private debt funds, which then I was taking out to market. When I left the asset management world, I actually spent a few years parking my career, and I headed off into the world of wildlife conservation. And I only mention this because this is where I met my current company. And ESG was always something I was incredibly passionate about. And the idea of taking my passion and working for an organization is really nirvana in my view. And I'm incredibly lucky in working for an organization that is serious about affecting meaningful change. And it really does start from the top. If you've got a leader that has a vision of change, you're in great hands to be able to make a difference. And we have that. Peter Hughes is our CEO. He is the founder of Apex Group, and he's incredibly passionate about doing good for both people and planet. He's incredibly focused on the environment and social matters. And as I said, we met through wildlife conservation work down in sub-Saharan Africa a few years ago. Supporting clients is a key aspect of Apex, and increasingly over the last couple of years, and no surprises to all of you, ESG has become a topic which everyone wants to talk about. But before we start talking about data, what I'd like to do briefly is just highlight what Apex Group is for those that don't know. So Apex Group is a financial services firm. It acts as a single source of solutions. It spans client operations, technology, banking requirements. It aims to reduce complexity and delivers efficiency. We like to think we provide a full suite of services to alternative asset managers, including fund administration, Manco, full depository, and so on. We support about 730 billion assets under administration. We've got 45 offices around the world, 3,500 staff. And we rank ourselves in the top 5. Strong local teams is very important to us, and that includes the work we do here in the Netherlands. Remco, if you could just shift to number 4, I'm just going to give a quick intro to Apex ESG ratings. That's perfect. So we launched about a year and a half ago. And we launched for 2 reasons, and I want to set this context because I think it's quite important. First of all, our client base was demanding something different in the ESG in the ESG world. I think Remco, you summed up your comment just now. Lack of data or lack of ability to get data really resonated with us, and so one of the challenges that we sought to overcome was how to collect data. And what we actually decided to do is to focus very specifically on the private market world. There is obviously a substantial number of organizations collecting data in the public sector, and you can purchase that data and put that to use. In the private sector, it's very different. There is not a database. It's for all the obvious reasons. And so that was an area which our clients were clearly hungry for. But the other reason why we set up this business, and in a sense, it's more important, and that's because we wanted to do something good with Apex. Apex finds itself in one of the top 5. And with that, there is a sense of responsibility, and all companies should feel this. There's a responsibility to play our part in delivering much needed change in the financial sector. So our product aims to be a catalyst for behavioural change in the investment process by delivering data in an efficient and usable format. So when we started out, the first thing we did is we listened. We were a blank sheet of paper, but we went to in excess of 250, 300 stakeholders. And this was before we'd even started developing our product. We wanted to know what the ESG issues were. We needed to hear their thoughts. We wanted to hear their concerns, the issues. We wanted to know why they were focusing on ESG, what they were doing about it, what were the pain points, and so on and so forth. And it was really only after we had listened and we'd looked at these pain points and the drivers did we really set about trying to create our product. And as mentioned, the focus became private sector. It became centric to data collection. It became about rating data, and it became focused on reporting data, but it didn't stop there. Most importantly, it became mostly about converting that data into positive action, and that's what we'll talk about now. But what I will do briefly, I'd just like to talk about some of the drivers. So when we went out to our 250 plus clients, we wanted to hear what they had to say. We wanted to know why they were involved, and really there were four primary reasons why everybody seems to be involved in ESG. And no surprises to all of you, investor pressure. Investors have been a driving force in translating the combined needs and requests of the end investor, which is us, it's the people on the street, and the various regulatory bodies which are driving, through government directives and legislation. This fiduciary requirement has been moving gradually down the financial supply chain, and increasingly we're seeing it becoming a definite need to have rather than a nice to have. Of course, another driver has been government and regulation. National, supranational governments and unions significantly driving change through regulation across the ESG universe. And my very, very simple advice is companies absolutely need to stay on top of this, and they need to stay ahead. It's going to change at an incredible pace, and it's certainly in the private sector. It's really kicking off with the March 2021 EU Sustainable Disclosure. And again, what I would say to companies is try and get ahead of it. Try and be a leader. If everybody panics and decides that they are going to comply all at the same time, you're not going to be differentiating yourself. So it's really important to stay up to date on regulations and what the governments are demanding. And I know all of you will be doing that, so I don't need to reiterate that too much. But in my view, the two major driving forces are employee pressure and moral obligation, and that's all of us. That's us who work for the companies. That's the people who are really recognizing, and it's the realization that the planet is in trouble. But very quickly on employee pressure, I really like what's happening at the moment, and that employees have different values. They seem to be shifting, and this is fantastic because it means that change is happening from the inside. People really do nowadays want to work for purpose-driven organizations that stand for more than just making money. This is vital for recruitment, it's vital for retention and motivation. And I think these critical but often overlooked metrics really are becoming more and more now about what a success means when we're looking at a company. But finally, let's talk about that moral desire and need for change, and it's really the realization that the panic. There is a sense of panic out there. The planet is in trouble, and increasingly it's felt at a very, very personal level. You can turn on the news. I mean, this morning I turned on the news, and I hear about the forest fires in the US. I hear about the rate of extinction going on in a number of countries around the world, and that was the first thing on our news in the UK, and I'm sure it resonates with all of you. Prior to COVID, the significant focus was on climate change, and that really was the top of the agenda. With obviously this horrific COVID virus, the S factor has leapt to attention, quite rightly, a little bit more, and how employers are looking after their employees in a situation like this is proving a very interesting discussion. But climate hasn't been parked. It's still very much there, and it's still being driven significantly. But also environment, biodiversity has really come to the fore as well. And there's huge discussions about whether this COVID virus potentially could have been completely avoided if we had focused more on biodiversity and we hadn't gone and reached into those parts of the world previously unexplored and introduced humans and human cattle and farming to areas where we are discovering new diseases. So it all really pulls together. But look, what I'd like to do now is really get to the matter that we want to talk about, and that's data. There were 4 major themes which kept coming back to us over the course of going out and meeting our companies. What data? How do we collect data? How do we turn that into positive actions? And how do we ensure that we're not viewed as someone who's trying to greenwash? So all significant points, and all points which I'm sure resonate with you. So let's kick off with what data. It is a largely unregulated area. It's incredibly complicated, and we have sympathy with everybody. Not only are there many global standards, but there are also a huge number of stakeholders using different ESG approaches and imposing different data demands on their new investments and the companies that they're investing in. And investors and businesses, they seem to be getting, I mean, they're getting pulled in many different directions, and it's tough. And the idea of collecting data set A and having to generate reports on that and put those reports out to certain stakeholders, collecting data set B and doing the same thing, it is very inefficient from a time point of view, and it's also incredibly hard to get real positive spin from the data that you're collecting. But right now there are multiple solutions, and this is tricky. There doesn't seem to be a single source as yet. Clearly stakeholders have got to comply with the fiduciary and the legal reporting needs, but they also need to build into their system the needs and the visions of their business, the data requirements, and they need to build that into a single approach. The KPIs that they focus on, they should be aligned to the best global standards in each specific area. This is going to ensure integrity, it's going to ensure relevance, longevity, but most importantly, it's going to help achieve change. And I'll come on to that in another section in a moment about change. But what Apex has done, we have looked at this as an issue, and we have looked to consolidate and not complicate. There's a I guess not a subtle difference, there's quite a big difference. There's a lot of people out there who are creating their own standards and probably wanting to be market leaders. We're not going out and creating our own standard or trying to be a market leader. We're putting together the best in class standards out there and saying, guys, these are the standards which we recommend you should align yourselves to. And there's a substantial list of them, and in this slide, obviously you can see a few. And so we've consolidated that data set. And so we've created one data set which aligns with, I think we use 12 or 13 global standards now. But look, it is complicated, it's confusing, but there's one thing which is really exciting, and that is the idea of what data, collecting data, is being taken incredibly positive. We're seeing very, very positive noises in the financial services around collecting data, and transparency is one of the key points here. If we are all happy to share our data, this is certainly going to lead to an increase in trust and greater action. But how we collect that data is a big issue. It will be no surprise to a lot of you, and I'm sure you're all far more efficient than this, but we've spoken to many entities that have lever arch files and paper collections of ESG data on their underlying portfolio companies and investments, or they've got Excels of data, or they've got Word documents packed with information. Fantastic, they have that information, but it's not in a format which you can do anything with. It makes it incredibly painful for companies to find data points when they need it, and especially in the private markets where they're really having to drag that data out of the private companies that they're dealing with. And again, we looked at this as a significant problem. You know, it's time inefficient. You've got this data. It's then you're gonna spend hours. You're gonna have interns. You're gonna have data analysts pouring through Excels, Word documents, paper documents, trying to find relevance, and that's not efficient. So what we have done is we've built a piece of software through which all data is uploaded, and not only that, when data is uploaded, we ask for proof of policy or proof of implementation, and we ask them to upload those documents and policies into one system. So within one system, you've got all your basic underlying data and supported materials. What I think a lot of companies are missing is that they are probably doing, inverted commas, a lot of ESG already in the form of good governance, social, environmental policy implementation. They're doing it. But what is now required is to showcase that efficiently. It's about showing the data points that you can back up your story with. And through software, it just makes it much easier and much more practical to do. And the reality is as well, this is the best and most efficient way of creating meaningful change. Coming on to meaningful change, positive action it's key for us. As I mentioned in my introduction, it's one of the reasons why we set up this product at Apex. We wanted to be a catalyst for change. We are a financial services provider, and we want to play our part, and we want to play a really significant part. And you know that comes from the heart. So what we try to work out is how do we create a system which helps people convert the data that they've collected into positive action. We had this question over and over again from the stakeholders we met, which was, okay, once we've got data, how do we know what's the right thing to do with it? We get the reporting piece, but if we want to be proactive and we want to start affecting change with our underlying investments or investee companies, how do we go about that process? And it's intuitively tough. So what we decided to do was to create a slightly more automated process by which this can take place. Our system, as mentioned earlier, has got a consolidated database. We take a data set and we take it to our client, who's the investment manager. They then take it to their underlying portfolio companies. The portfolio companies fill in a questionnaire based on all these data points. Once that questionnaire has been complete, we then check and analyze that, and I'll come on to that in a second, because that's a discussion I want to have around green and purpose washing. But what we then do is we compare the data which is presented by the portfolio company, and we compare that to the relevant global standard, and every single one of our data points is aligned to a global standard. So we compare the two, and we highlight the gap between the portfolio company data and the best-in-class standard. And we create a list of those gaps, and we call it simply the gap analysis. And then what we do is, where there are significant gaps, we look at those best-in-class standards, we look at the recommendations, and we apply those recommendations to the gap. So the investment manager can quite clearly look at company A, it can see a data point, this is where he is. It can look at the best-in-class standard, all within a piece of software. It can then look at the recommendations which that best-in-class standard has recommended in order to get that data point, or what we call the gap, closed. So this is a simple, intuitive way of providing a positive spin to all the data that is being collected in the private company sector. And this positive action has proved without a doubt, this gap analysis has proved without a doubt to be one of the most taken up pieces of our model. Finally, I'll just talk about green / purpose washing. Again, we've been asked a number of times, how do we avoid that? And I mentioned just now, when we collect data, what we do is we check its veracity, and so we ask an investee company to upload their data, and we ask for proof. So if they say they've got a policy, we ask them to upload that policy. We then say, does your policy contain A, B, C, D, E? We then check their answers against the policy that they've provided. So we check its veracity, we make sure that it's real, and by doing that, we ensure a degree of independence. And I think that's becoming that term is becoming more and more important. There is increasing cynicism over the concept of reporting on your own work. It doesn't happen in the financial world, and increasingly, I think we're going to see that change in ESG as well. ESG world as well. It's no longer acceptable to mark your own homework, and so we apply an independent service. And in fact, we've won business as a direct result of the fact that on behalf of clients, we're going out and independently collecting data from their investments, applying a rating to that, and reporting to their stakeholders independently of any input from them. And I think that is going to be something which is going to be a bit of a driving force as we move forward. So look, just to summarize, the four burning issues that kept coming up: what data, how to collect the data, how to convert it into positive action, and how to ensure that we are not viewed as greenwashing. How can we ensure transparency? I like to think that we have gone out to solve these in our product, specifically in the private market space, and we've created a single source end-to-end solution. But to close, a little call to action. I think this is the absolute time to embrace ESG, and I'm not preaching to you guys, because I'm sure you're all right behind it already, and it's for all the right reasons. It's here to stay. It's the need for it's accelerating, and it can be enormously powerful. The financial sector, I think, has got a huge duty, as much as anyone else, to do its part to ensure long-term security of our planet. It's something I'm very passionate about. It's why I joined Apex, to create this product and make a difference, and I hope that resonates in the last sort of 10-15 minutes of what I've been talking about. But I'll hand back to you guys now. Thank you very much for your time, and any questions either now or afterwards, I'm happy to answer.
Thanks, Andy. That's fantastic. For anybody who wants to put in, I have an echo here. So Andy, maybe you have to put it on mute. Yes, I think it's better. So for anybody who wants to put any questions in, you can do that with the button on the right top of your screen with a question mark in it. Some people have already found it. And one of the first things, Andy, that came in was a compliment for such an engaging and passionate sharing of the urgency of ESG and the need to act in the face of climate change and the loss of biodiversity. That was even liked by several people in the call. So thank you. We're not used to have someone of the fund administration party to be so passionate about it. So that's it's good to see that we have common ground. So probably more questions come in, but we have a first a real question coming in. So they ask, could we describe Apex as an EMS? Does it say anything to you, like an EMS?
An EMS, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what that means.
Me neither.
That
so
let's elaborate, that would be great.
Maybe they can clarify the question. Would it be possible to extract any data like energy, water, waste data via Apex for an asset management portfolio, or should the company deliver the data itself?
So the way our model works is each individual investee company has to upload their own data. But absolutely, that data set also includes emissions, it includes waste, it includes water, electricity usage, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So the questions that we ask include all of that data. So once that data is built into that portfolio, you as an investment manager will have all that data within the software for you to do what you want with. Yes.
That's clear. And how do you deal with clients who don't deliver any evidence? Is a question.
It's a very good question. If they don't, in order to get a score, they very simply have to provide that evidence. So if they say yes, we have a policy in so and so, but they don't provide us with that policy, that's a 0. And then the gap analysis will highlight the fact that you verbally said you have a policy, but you haven't submitted that. Now there is a process that we will go through before we create their final score and rating, and so we will always give them a chance and go back to them. We create what we call a sort of a data gap. So we'll say, look, you've said you've ticked the box and said you've got a policy, but you haven't updated it, you haven't uploaded it. So we will always give them a chance of providing that proof. If they can't provide a proof, they don't get a score for it, because we have to maintain the rigorous control over our output.
And it's also an interesting remark from someone who says companies suffer from survey fatigue. Because why don't you just check the company website for policy documents instead of asking them to upload it and basically read it to you? Why don't you collect it yourself?
In the public sector, I would wholeheartedly agree with you. In the private sector, we are dealing with companies in some cases that have very, very simple websites and simply don't publish that sort of information. And actually, by going direct to that company, the idea is we want to work with these companies and support a positive move when it comes to ESG. But yes, we will go the lengths that we need to get the information. But ultimately, if that can be provided by the end company, fantastic. And I wholeheartedly get the idea of fatigue. And we thought about this long and hard. Our software is very simple to use. In theory, there's 300 data points which could be asked, but we have 100 what I call unlock questions, 100 unlock questions. So unlock question number 1 will be, do you have an HR policy? If you click yes to that, it then intuitively takes you to another level of questions. If you click no to that, you go straight on to the next one. So for those that are at an early stage of their ESG journey, it's a pretty quick process. But the further you are along your ESG journey, the more questions, dependent questions, are going to be released to you in order for you to be able to showcase how well you're doing in ESG. So we have tried to make it incredibly user-friendly, and also that's all that information is constantly stored. So the following year, you don't have to go and repeat the entire survey. All you have to do is update and amend those data points where you have proved improvement.
Yeah, thanks for answering that question. I want to get back, it's a personal question from my side, because I really liked your introduction with your 4, let's say, drivers for ESG. And there you see it really comes from the public as well. And that's something we, from government and public, that's something we see in the Netherlands and strongly feel, because there's a lot of pressure put on us. But what I noticed myself as a director of an association, when we do lobby in Brussels, that other European countries feel far less of this pressure. How do you see, globally, a difference in this? How do you view that?
Look, I like you. I outside of work, I'm heavily involved in a number of organisations that focus on the environment. So it's a tough one for me to answer, because I'm incredibly passionate about it and I feel it. My sense is that certainly the organisation I'm working for, I'm really excited the way the general view of the employees is incredible excitement that we have got this product. And if I use that as a sort of a marker point, when I talk to my friends, when I talk to extended colleagues and so on, there is a definite positive sense around what we're doing and the need for what we're doing. And look, we're not out here alone doing this. I mean, this is a movement to try and affect the huge amount of damage we've done over the last 30, 40, 100, 150 years. And I think the public right now is, I mean, no surprises. The voice is as loud globally as we have ever heard, which is why this is the easiest time for us to get this right, because we've got significant support. And whether that's global, I'm not sure. We're certainly, this is massively a political debate, but there are certain global leaders that might not be as behind it as possible. But I think the man and lady on the street are absolutely behind this movement, and I think it's only there to see. That's environmental and social, by the way. We're not just talking about saving the planet, but we're talking about the significant social issues. And I think it's we see it on the news pretty much every day now. Whereas if we would go back a few years, it wasn't so apparent. So I think it's very hot on the press at the moment.
Yeah, but I also always get the warnings like, be aware that for every person who's lobbying for, let's say, sustainable actions, there are 1,000 people lobbying against, because it's of such a huge impact for so many companies and industries. We have to be aware that there are also people outside our bubble very much against all of this. That's what I usually get. But there are much more questions from from participants to the call. So what I would suggest is that we move to the next speaker, see if we have some time left at the end. But there are also a lot of practical questions about your system. So I suggest that we try to answer those outside this call and make sure that that it's sent to the participants, your replies to a lot of practical questions about the way you rate and how you use certain data. So we will get back to those, I hope, with your replies, Andy.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much so far. Hopefully we have some time left at the end. So we would like to move forward to Annabeth from EY, who, as Remco said in the beginning, EY developed a 5-step approach to ESG reporting, and Annabeth is briefly going to dive into some of those steps. Annabeth.
Yes, thanks, Iris. Yes, given the topic of today, we'll just touch on a few points of the 3rd step. And I think it's a nice bridge as well to Joost, who will, from ASR Asset Management, who will share with us in a bit, how this process is currently taking place at ASR. So in the step of defining KPIs, collecting data and measuring results, of course, the first step is to determine what to measure. I think that Andy gave some really nice insights into that. It's also nice to hear that much more data is coming available in the private sphere as well as in emerging markets, not touched upon, but also very important. And also in webinar 1, but also in research by Investment Leader Group, there's a lot out there to determine what KPIs to focus on. And then in terms of implementation, relating to the 2nd step, it's really helpful to have something like a Raki table to really determine who in my organization is responsible, who is accountable, or eindverantwoordelijk in Dutch, to structure the process in also a step-by-step approach. It's actually already the 4th point. To have that in line. It sounds very logical, but it provides a clear guidance on the steps to take when you know who is responsible and who is going to take care of that. And then the C and the I of that are the people that are being consulted and the people that are being informed. Of course, the next step is to collect that data, assess the availability and reliability. We touched upon the challenges in that. It depends on the asset class, but fortunately more data is becoming available. We also see parties that might not have taken steps earlier on can now also skip a few steps and, for example, integrate data right into their data warehouse, and in that way also increase the reliability and also the accuracy over time. So that's good to see. The 4th step relates to, as referred to, standard operating procedure. It's good to know what are the person, what are the departments, the systems that are being used, how do we report within the organization, but also to the clients and those who have investments. And that also relates to risk management, compliance, and assurance. Having these steps clear, knowing who is doing what and what systems are involved, really provides a basis for risk management, compliance, and assurance, because these are important aspects that have to be known. And then, of course, reporting on the progress in KPIs, not only the KPIs you've decided to focus on, for example, CO2 figures, but also in a qualitative sense. And we've looked at some examples in the first webinar. Again, on the example of CO2 emissions make sense when you can express qualitatively what is in your portfolio or what is in your fund. And the same goes for jobs created. Of course, the KPIs have to match your investment strategy, and then providing some examples in a qualitative sense or giving meaning to your KPIs, and the targets may be related to that, provides the reader and one who invested in the fund some fundamental information that has to go hand in hand. And this information, for example, quarterly or on the other basis, is relevant to not only investors, but also to other stakeholders. Of course, these ESG policies can then be integrated into risk management, compliance, and the assurance steps. And as we see all the upcoming legislation of the EU Sustainable Finance Plan, it's good to have it future-proof and to already consider those upcoming legislation. And I know that Joost from ASR will also touch on that. So maybe that's a nice bridge.
Yeah, very nice bridge. Thank you, Annabeth, because it looks very nice on the slide to implement all these steps. But how's that in practice? Joost Notenboom, you're available to share your experience from practice. Thank you so much to be available for this. You're on the phone, so we have to make sure that you're off mute. That at first. Not sure if I can do that. Maybe someone can put Joost off mute. And Joost is in practice in ASR involved in all the implementation of sustainability. He said, you can introduce me as a portfolio manager without a portfolio, really actually managing a portfolio, but just to make it happen within ASR. So if we can get Joost online. Joost, you're still on mute, I can see, to share your experiences from your side. Noah, could you help us to put Joost off mute? Yeah, he's still on mute. Call him again. Do you know, Remco, how we can get him in the call?
I'm trying as well, but we can call him on his mobile. Then I will call you on your mobile, or we put you on speaker then. Yes, just a second.
Yeah.
Maybe in the meantime we can. If there's another queue coming in, Iris, and in the meantime I call Joost.
Yeah, sure. We have a lot of questions still for you, Andy. So, and I thought a very good question. And Andy, I don't know if you're still available to take the question, because I thought it's a good question. How do you know that the data you receive is reliable? And I thought that was quite a good question, because of course you can upload it and say this is it.
So
how do you know?
It's a very good question. The way our model works is we work with the client, who is generally the investor, and the portfolio company that they are invested in. So generally, there is already a substantial good working relationship in place. So what we don't do is we don't go knocking on the doors of private companies and say, can you provide us with your data, please? That would be, for a start, they wouldn't want to provide us with their data. They've got no reason to provide us with the data. And we wouldn't really have, there's no relationship there in order to—
Hello, can you hear me?
To ensure that veracity. By working with the investor, who is already carried out significant due diligence and is part of—
Hello, is anybody on the phone?
Yeah, we can hear you, Joost.
Yeah.
We're just finishing a question with Andy, and then we get to you.
I'll be very brief. So where the investor, for example, is a significant or majority stakeholder in a private company, there's a significant sense of trust, and they are part of that company. And so we collect the data, and then we compare data to all the supportive documentation. Now, it would be a significantly long process to come up with fake. All the policies be fake, and also, you know, it could happen. We do our best to try and ensure that we protect the client against that. But I'll stop there. Sorry, I know.
Thank you. So no, thank you for picking up the question. And Joost, it's great to have you on the line. We already briefly introduced you. So how does this all work in practice in ASR? And maybe you kick off first with introducing yourself and your role in ASR.
Sure, thank you all. I'll just chalk this up to a win for the ASR firewall, I suppose. And I'll try to keep it brief in the interest of time. I think it's the curse of being the last speaker. But yeah, that was all pretty clear. I think combined with the insights from the previous webinar and the speakers today, it seems pretty straightforward. All we need to do now is implement. But yeah, there's an unbelievable amount of material available on the EU action plan, besides obviously the legal text and drafts. There are dozens of opinions, interpretations, consultation, technical reviews, and obviously practitioner websites or webinars such as this one. So for someone like me, and there's no shortage of reading, even though I already call myself an expert on the action plan or maybe even on ESG reporting. But my name is Joost Notenboom. I joined ASR in December after having held previous roles in banking and professional services, both here in the Netherlands and Australia, and always had a focus on climate change and broader sustainability issues. And for those who don't know ASR, we're a Dutch insurance company with roots going back over 300 years. It's our birthday this year. And I recently learned that we actually still own a Dutch government bond that was issued in 1814 after the French occupation to rebuild the Netherlands, which I thought was quite interesting on one day after our National Budget Day. So we have probably around 4,200 staff, of which around 170 to 180 work in asset management, where we manage about 70 billion euros for both the insurer and third-party clients. And practically speaking, that means everybody works or used to work pre-COVID from the office here in lovely Utrecht. We're a long-term investor, and all our AUM is covered by our responsible investing policy. Its first iteration was published in 2007, which offers guardrails on topics such as climate change, human rights, controversial weapons, but also the way we screen our company investments and our sovereign investments, as well as our external managers. So that being said, our clients can opt for more stringent criteria within the mandates, but not for less, as those set out in our SRI policy. Practically also, we prefer Eurozone investing, given the guidelines in our client mandates and regulation. And we are a Dutch insurance company, we have our clients here. And we invest across sovereign bonds, listed corporate bonds and equities, as well as some private debt and private equity. Next to us as an asset manager, we have our colleagues in real estate. They also invest in real assets, such as residential, retail, and office properties, but also, for instance, rural real estate. Interesting factoid is that ASR is the largest private owner of agricultural land in the Netherlands, with a portfolio of roughly 41,000 hectares. So all in all, we do pretty well in the various third-party responsible investment rankings and ratings. So hopefully we'll continue to do well when assessed under this new regime and definition of the EU's Sustainable Finance Action Plan. So that's just a bit of background on myself and on ASR, and just to dive a bit more into detail on how does this all relate to the action plan on sustainable finance. On the slide in front of you, I've just put down a few key points from the EU action plan across the various acts and delegated acts. There's a lot of focus, obviously, mostly on either the SFDR, the disclosure regulation, or on taxonomy, but it's broader, as you all know, and we've been looking into a more detail during these past few months on various parts of the broader action plan. That means that when looking at, for instance, the SFDR, which is what the previous speaker also mentioned, the first one after rank, with its first implementation date scheduled for March 2021, as it currently stands. From an entity or product level perspective, we feel that it's relatively clear what the scope of the impact will be. And forgive my economical use of slides, but I always believe that less is more. So just using this background and voiceover. And also, as an aside, during the last webinar, Randy from Dufas went into quite some detail on the various requirements under the SFDR and taxonomy. So I won't repeat that more here, but rather summarize, quote unquote, the main ones. So with scope, what I just mentioned, I mean that firstly, the areas of the ASR business that will be impacted. So for instance, asset management, real estate, but also our life insurance business line as quote unquote financial market participants who offer or manage investment products or advice. And secondly, what I mean by scope is which products under these business lines are in scope. Like I said, real estate offers funds under AIFM regulation, and so does asset management, so do we. So making an inventory of these and their respective benchmarks, if they use one, would be a good step on your SFDR journey, I would say. And why their benchmarks? That's a good question, maybe. That goes towards that Article 9 distinction, meaning the dark green variant of the investment product. I know there's a lot of uncertainty around what the actual differences are or will be between Articles 6, 8, and 9 strategies or products, and what the final delegated act of the SFDR, when it's expected by the end of this year, will actually stipulate. And it's all a bit of speculation the moment what it will end up being. But I know various parties, also those present on the call, have been providing their analysis and thinking on the matter, and have been making various cases on the distinction between the articles. Once you have that inventory, I think it's then up to each individual market participant to assess your portfolio. Also, within the broader context of the MiFID II and AIFMD requirements, to ask clients their ESG preferences. And of course, your own strategic decisions around positioning. Remember, the SFDR is in a sense a transparency tool, not so much a normative judgment on whether you should be green, but rather that if you choose to be green, then here's the list of requirements that make you green under the EU definition. And having said all that, once you have some sense of which business line, so for instance, real estate, life insurance, and asset management for the SFDR, will be impacted by which delegated act at which time. And I know that's already quite a job. We did that, for instance, as a tandem between the ESG team, so myself and regulatory affairs. It might then be a good idea to start an internal project, bringing people together. Like I mentioned before, we're not a particularly large or spread out organization. We have one office where most of our staff work or used to work pre-COVID. And even for someone like myself, who's been working from home the majority of my ASR career, it's quite doable to reach out to colleagues from, for instance, client reporting, sales, and regulatory affairs, but also portfolio management, risk management, fund management, to go through some of the steps. And I know some of them on the line right now. However, I can also imagine that for larger asset managers with hundreds or even thousands of funds and associated documentation and portfolio teams, just these two steps will be quite challenging, especially when the subject matter is new, quote unquote. I don't think it's new, but it might be new. I understand that for some people, for instance, their daily lives have revolved around the EU Action Plan for many years now. Well, so for example, those in the technical working groups or those in Brussels drafting the various legislative acts. But for many in the industry, it's a relatively new thing, and it's complicated with a lot of jargon and moving parts. And to complement the previous speaker, yes, we have set up a RACI as well to make sure everybody's held accountable and we can measure progress. To touch on the point of ESG data, I know a lot has already been said and written about its importance for SFDR compliant reporting, taxonomy reporting, and that's obvious. And I think having read some of the SFDR consultation papers that were sent to Brussels prior to September 1st, when the consultation on the Delegated Act finished, that point has been stressed. We all know that there are limitations to ESG data availability and quality. But from my own personal experience, having had some discussions over the past few months with large ESG data vendors, my sense is that this will mature over time, which I think Andy stressed and pointed out as well. And I think this is obviously the whole point of the NFRD, so the Company Reporting Act and the SFDR. Perhaps in similar manner as, for example, scenario analysis was or is within TCFD reporting. Although I appreciate that was a voluntary standard, even though New Zealand has just made it mandatory, and this is a mandatory standard from the start. I do share the point on materiality. A list of 32 indicators seems excessive. I think our friends at EY here might have something to say about that. I believe they proposed, together with the other big four, a list of 22 core metrics at the latest World Economic Forum. But whatever the final list will be, we as an asset manager will surely be using an ESG data vendor to provide us with that data and reporting. And it is practically infeasible to approach all these investee companies directly. I would hate to be in investor relations at a large corporate after March 2021, when hundreds or even thousands of institutional investors from across Europe will be writing to you to fill in a template. Furthermore, I suspect there might be some asset managers or insurance companies, banks or pension funds within the EU, which have to start at first principles and do not maybe yet have a responsible investment strategy or policy. And as such, really do need to start at the beginning and haven't even thought about sourcing ESG data or making a distinction between Article 809 products. Remember, this is a pan-EU plan across all 27 countries, and I would be quite curious to learn from our EY colleagues whether they organize similar webinar series, for instance, across the EU. In the interest of time, going to the second slide. This is an overview of all our current ESG reporting, complemented with and that would be a good step, second step in your journey to make an overview, complemented with any pre-contractual or prospectus documentation, which will need to be updated. Again, Randy's presentation last week provided a good overview of potential avenues for disclosure, website fact sheets, annual reports, and the like. And this slide gives a screenshot of some of our corporate or investment communications we currently use, such as our quarterly annual report, website, but also the fund fact sheets. Quickly going to the third slide, then we will be looking as part of this whole process to evaluate whether we can improve our ESG reporting further. And we're actually currently testing a new tool to help us with that, so stay tuned. And to sum up, that brings me to my last point. I believe the EU hopes that this action plan will have the same sort of effect as the GDPR had in 2017-19, when even my Australian bank had to mobilize resources to implement all the requirements under this European legislation on data protection. And I think it will. Recently, the UK Economic Secretary to the Treasury already confirmed that the UK intends to, at the very least, match the ambition of the EU action plan, even in a post-Brexit environment. So I'm sure others will follow. Good ideas have a tendency to spread. And to sum up, to finalize, standardized reporting and frameworks, they make sense and can only help make more informed investment decisions. But reporting is not the goal here. Maybe I will preach a little bit here. Reporting is a means for collective action, and I want to stress that. The goal is to get back to that 1.5 to 2 degree pathway, because we're currently massively overshooting it at the moment, and to deliver on the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and that's only 10 years away. So right now there's still uncertainty and unclarity on several timelines and alignment between some of the delegated acts, but remember that we're in a process, and that might mean we won't get it right 100% at the first go. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joost. And on behalf of time, I only have one closing question for you and Andy. Like, what is for the coming months your key challenge, which is on your list where you're worried about? I can ask Joost first. So Joost, what is your key challenge for the coming months?
The key challenge is to keep the overview between all the various delegated acts, all the level 2 legislation coming out of it, and making strategic decisions on where we'd like to play or continue to play.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Andy, for you, what is your key challenge?
I think the key challenge is staying ahead of all the regulatory updates, all the changes going on, and we're not just talking about the European Union, but globally as well. Just mentioned New Zealand, and ensuring that our clients are up to date with the facts that they need to make informed decisions around implementing ESG. And I think that's probably the challenge for everybody. But I certainly feel that as a service provider, we hold that challenge probably more than some.
Yes, thank you for that, and thanks for your contribution to our data challenge. Remco, shall we close off this webinar? Do you have any closing remarks from your side?
No, that it's exactly 1 o'clock. That I'm very, very pleased with the presenters and all the attendees and the Q&As, etc. And that we're going to share the slides and the recording afterwards as well. That's my only, and that we're looking forward to the next event. Anything to add to that?
Next week, Wednesday, 12 o'clock, and we will look into the validation of data, where EY will give their experience to validation of data, where they build up some experience. And we have an asset manager who already has a few funds which are checked and validated by EY, who will tell their experience about that, how that works, and what the challenges are in those processes. So tune in again next week, subscribe to the webinar for next week, and thank you very much for tuning in. Thanks to all the speakers, Andy, Joost, Annabeth, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.